And welcome back. Let's go ahead and add the ability to control our laser fire so that it only triggers when we are firing a button. And so the way we're going to handle this is by actually going first into our assets here. Let's go over to our input and go to player controls. And currently we just have one set up for move, but we also want one for when we're firing our button. And so we can just hit this little plus action here, and that will allow us to add a new thing. So we can call this fire. We could call it, player fire, player weapon, whatever we want to call it. If I want to call it like fire weapon, for example, that would be the name of it. And we'll have to name it accordingly. You can call it, of course, just call it fire. That works too. But the most important thing is that we come in here and we want to add a binding here. Now notice that right now there are no bindings. And I'm actually going to set this up so that way we can use both our space bar, and I can also add a binding for a mouse press. And so now if I press listen with my mouse key, you notice it doesn't actually work. So I need to actually go down to where it says mouse and then find my left button there. And so now I have both of those set up. So I can actually head over to my scripts folder. And let's go ahead and create ourselves a new model behavior script and call this one player weapons. And once that script is open, let's go ahead and just remove our methods here. And we're going to create a public void method here. Now, whatever we call this has to match whatever the name of that input action was. So, for example, before we had on move, because the name of our thing was called move, if we had this called fire, it would be called on fire. But I think I called mine fire weapon, so I would just go on fire weapon. Open close parentheses and curly brackets. And just to test this out, let's do a debug.log and have it say something simple like firing weapon. So firing weapons looks good. Save that. Now notice it doesn't have the using Unity input engine. I'm just going to add that in there because we want to make sure that this is available to use it. Now notice it's grayed out, so we may not need this, but I'm just going to add it in here. It's not going to hurt anything, but just in case we need to call back to it, we can. And so now back in Unity, let's just go ahead and grab our player weapon script, drag and drop that on in. So now it's attached. And if we give everything a quick run here, if I go to my console and I press spacebar, notice pressing spacebar does not do it, but if I press the left mouse button, that is working. Spacebar is not. So it means we would have to test that, see why exactly spacebar is not working. But we are at least getting it with the left mouse click, so that is working pretty good. We might have to just add an additional binding in there to make sure that it works properly, but at least we have the left mouse button working. You can see that my debugs are increasing. Now, one of the things you might have noticed is when I was doing that is that it only increased the count if I had pressed the mouse button. But let's just say I want to hold the mouse button down and fire continuously. Well, the way for us to do this, we're going to need something that's going to keep track of this right here. And I just realized why my spacebar wasn't working. For some reason, we didn't have our input value here, which sometimes auto-populates for us. It didn't populate this time, so I just went and added that back in. So that should fix our spacebar issue. But this value that we are passing in here is something that we can actually use to help determine whether or not we are doing continuous input. So let's start this off by creating ourselves a private bool. And we're just going to say, hey, this is a private bool. We want this to keep track of basically if we are actually firing. So we'll just say is firing. And let's initialize that to false because we don't want our game to start with the lasers firing right off the bat. So we're just going to set that to false. And what I'm going to do is I actually want to have something where this on fire weapon is checking to see if the is firing is true. So let's just add in here and just say is firing. Instead of saying equals true, let's look to see if value dot is pressed. And this is just a way to return something. So is pressed actually just returns true or false. And so that's going to update this is firing for me. And so that's, again, a quick way to see if whether or not that is correct. Now, how do we actually take this to check to see if this is needing to be printed or not? Well, we've handled things like this before, and we've done that using conditionals. And so if you remember what a conditional is, that's just simply a if statement. So we can say if is firing, and we do curly brackets here. And all I'm going to do is move my debug statement so it's inside the if. And that should take care of things. So this is just going to say, hey, if this is firing, go ahead and set this value from here to true. So that updates this. If this is true, print out the message. Now, the only problem is that this does not even though this does solve part of our issue, there's one more thing we need to do, and that is to bring back in our update method. Because if we don't have the update method, it's not going to actually call this. So we want to call our on-fire weapon. Now notice this one says input value. So I'm actually going to want to maybe do this with a easier way. So let's make a method called process firing, because then I don't have to worry about trying to call in these different values. Now, of course, it says we don't have a method called that. So let's go ahead and generate a method here called process firing. And I'm simply just going to take my if statement, move that from here, replace this throw statement, and we'll just clean this method up here, take some of the space out. But what this will do is that we're having this method in here. It's just like how we have the method over here. It allows us to call things every frame. And so that is going to allow us every frame that we have going on, it's going to call this process firing, which is going to, of course, look at this is firing call down here. So these are going to kind of work in tandem to each other. All right, so over in Unity, let's go ahead and clear this out, give it a quick run. And here goes our ship. And so if I press my left mouse button, I'm just going to click and hold, and look, there it goes. I'm going to release, and you can see my input is still going on. Even though I've let go of my mouse button, I'm not clicking on anything, which means we have a small error to handle. Now, of course, we could easily handle this with some code, but there's also other ways that we can do this that don't necessarily involve us getting into the scripting side. So to do this without having to worry about a bunch of fancy coding, we're actually going to go back over to our input, go over our player controls, and if we look at our fire weapon here, there's this little field called interaction. So if we hit plus on this, all right, we can see we have a few different options in here. Same thing when we look at our left mouse button and stuff like that. Again, we have a bunch of different things, but I'm going to handle it from the top level here. And so in here, what do we want to actually make these interactions be? So for example, if I go ahead and click on press, it's going to load up this thing. It says, hey, this is when you're pressing down a button. And it says trigger behavior is set to press only. Well, press only basically just looks to see that the key has been pressed. It doesn't do anything about if we release it. So if I click this drop down, change it to press and release, it now changes that behavior to only basically register if we have pressed and released the key. So it should hopefully solve some of our issues at it. So if we hit save asset, close that, go back to my console so we can watch this behavior. Let's go ahead and press play, see if that did it. I'm going to click. Okay, we're firing. I'm going to release, and it stopped. Excellent. Do the spacebar, so let's do the same thing. So I'm going to press, release, and it stopped. Perfect. So that, of course, is controlling our behavior now with the weapons. Now, you might have noticed that currently my lasers aren't firing when I'm running this game, and that's because what I did is actually in my player here, if I go to my player laser for a second, I've actually shut off the emission field here. So that's why when this is running, you're not seeing the lasers firing. If I click that button, that allows those lasers to start firing off again. So I'm actually going to want to use that as the thing I control and expose it within Unity so we can toggle it on off for when the player is actually doing their firing. Instead of us simply just having a debug message, we can actually make this into something worthwhile for the player to see. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So what I'm going to do is just at the top of my class, let's go ahead and create ourselves a serialized field. And we're going to make this of type game object. And it's suggesting weapon. Okay, that's perfectly fine because that is what we're doing. We call it weapon, laser, whatever we want. Doesn't matter. I'm just going to stick with weapon for now. And I'm going to come down here to my process firing because up here I had this debug log statement, but we want to make it so that we're controlling our emission toggle on and off. All right, and so what I'm going to do is let's just take out this debug statement because we know everything is working here. And what we want to actually do is, since this game object is a particle system, we're going to go down to that particle system. And it's dot, and we want the emission module because what are we toggling? Well, we're toggling emission, so that's what's going to go back and forth. And we're going to go ahead and give this a name. So think about what are the things that we are controlling here. So let's just call, since it's the emission module, we'll just call this player emission. And I'm going to set this equal to weapon dot get component. And let's go ahead and just auto-complete that. Just take a look and see if that is correct. All right, well, this is just maybe a little too much. I'm actually going to scale back to being just particle system and then open close parentheses dot emission. And that should encapsulate that pretty nicely for me. All right, and so now what we want to do is basically toggle that field on and off. And so what we're going to do is we're going to rely on our player mission. And if you look, there's actually a dot is enabled. And we don't want to set this to false because at this point we want to set it to true because that's what's actually going to have our particles be flying in and out of our game. Now, before we get too crazy with testing anything, one thing I want to test real quick is, of course, I have my weapon here, which, of course, is right now set to none. So I need to go ahead and add something to that. So since this is our weapon, we can just grab our player laser, drag and drop that on in there. So now that's in there. And now I did, of course, leave that if statement in there for is firing, which could still be okay. But because we have that it.enable tag, we may not end up needing it. So let's just go ahead and press play here. And so if I press my button, looks like that's going, but my lasers are still firing. So yeah, let's go ahead and take that if statement out of there. And that might clean that up here because, again, we don't really need to have this if statement because we are now controlling things with this .enabled true bit of code. And so that should help clean that up. Oh, and I realize there's one other thing I did. I left this set to true. Oh, that could be part of our problem there. So actually, let's back that up just a second here because remember, we don't have a variable called true. We have one called is firing. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and take that if statement out just because, again, it's going to clean things up. And I can just change this to is firing. That should, of course, clean that up because now it's controlled directly by that Boolean. All right, and so now we press play. All right, not firing. Let's press our left mouse button. Okay, oh, I see my space bars in action. We have some lasers going here. All right, looks like that's going. All right, excellent. So we are firing our laser. Laser looks pretty good. If I hold it down, we also have our laser firing out. So I think we are starting to actually take form here. Our game is coming together real nice.